For decades, we've been taught to believe that factory muscle cars were the undisputed kings of the street. Bigger budgets, engineering teams, magazine tests, and dealership warranties all told the same story. If it came from Detroit, it was untouchable. Horsepower numbers climbed, badges got louder, and the myth grew stronger with every ad campaign. But myths tend to fall apart the moment rubber meets asphalt. Because while manufacturers were busy fighting spec sheet wars, something uncomfortable was happening far from the spotlight. In garages that smelled like oil and frustration, with tools bought second-hand and parts sourced through favors, a different kind of V8 was being built. No press releases, no dyno bragging rights, just an obsession with making something effective. And when these backyard creations lined up against factory heroes, the outcome wasn't supposed to be close. Yet, time after time, the truth showed up first. That's where the contradiction begins to sting. If the factories had all the money, data, and talent, how could something improvised embarrass them so completely? What does it say about performance when the most dangerous car on the street isn't the one with the biggest logo, but the one no one saw coming? This isn't just a story about horsepower. It's about freedom, constraints, and how innovation lives where nobody is looking. When people look back on the muscle car era, they tend to remember it as a time when factories ruled absolutely. This was the age of glossy magazine covers, quarter-mile tests printed in bold ink, and showroom floors filled with promises. Big manufacturers poured millions into research, engineering, and marketing, all to prove a single point. Their car was faster, tougher, and more advanced than the one parked next to it. Horsepower numbers became headlines, and brand loyalty became identity. Factory muscle cars felt unbeatable for good reason. Teams, not individuals, engineered them. They came with warranties that implied confidence and reputations built on racing success and mass production muscle. If a car wore a famous badge, people assumed it had already been pushed to its limits by professionals with access to tools and data no private builder could dream of. The idea that something homemade could challenge that authority felt almost disrespectful. This dominance shaped expectations. When two cars lined up, the outcome seemed predetermined before the engines even fired. The factory car carried legitimacy, while anything built outside that system was dismissed as a gamble at best, a joke at worst. That mindset mattered because it's what made the eventual outcome so jarring. To embarrass a legend, the legend first has to feel untouchable. And that sense of certainty was powerful because it discouraged questions. It trained enthusiasts to trust factories by default and overlook experimentation entirely. In that world, reputation weighed more than results, and assumptions mattered more than outcomes, setting the stage for a shock nobody wanted to believe was possible at the time, when dominance felt permanent and unchallengeable to everyone watching. That's why almost no one noticed the builder at first. There was no shop sign, no crew shirts, no reputation carried in from racing trophies or magazine features. Just a person, or sometimes a small group of friends, working late nights in a cramped garage because they couldn't stop thinking about what the factories refused to do. They didn't have access to wind tunnels or test tracks. They didn't even have the comfort of knowing failure wouldn't ruin them financially. Every mistake came out of their own pocket. What they did have was obsession, an irritation with compromise, a sense that factory cars were built for averages, not for the edge cases where performance actually lives. Emissions rules, warranties, and cost targets felt like excuses, not limitations. So instead of asking what was approved, they asked what was possible. They studied parts catalogues like blueprints, learned through trial and error, and trusted seat-of-the-pants feedback over corporate simulations. To the outside world, this builder barely existed. No press cared. No brand benefited from the effort. If the engine failed, there would be no recall, no press release, no safety net at all. And that invisibility created freedom. Without an audience to impress, the only metric that mattered was results. Faster was better. stronger was necessary. Quiet success meant everything. That's what made the eventual outcome so uncomfortable. When someone with nothing to lose starts outperforming institutions with everything to protect, it forces a question nobody wants to answer. Maybe authority isn't earned by scale or logos, but by who is willing. On paper, the engine made very little sense. It didn't follow the neat logic that factories relied on, where every choice had to balance cost, longevity, emissions, and customer error. This V8 was built around a different question entirely. What actually works when none of those constraints matter? Parts were chosen not because they were new or approved, but because they solved specific problems. Cylinder heads were ported unevenly, not for symmetry, but to favor real airflow. Compression ratios crept higher than any manufacturer would dare sign off on, flirting with danger in exchange for response. The camshaft choice alone would have sent an engineering committee into panic. Idle quality was rough, manners were non-existent, and low-speed drivability was a sacrifice the builder accepted without hesitation. Fuel delivery was tuned by feel and repetition, not spreadsheets, often running richer than factory logic allowed because heat, not efficiency, was the real enemy. Cooling was overbuilt. Rotating assemblies were balanced by hand. Nothing was optimized for mass production because this engine was never meant to be repeated 1,000 times. To anyone trained in factory methodology, it looked flawed. Risky tolerances, inconsistent sourcing, no long-term durability testing beyond what the builder could afford to break. Yet that apparent mess hid a deeper understanding of physics. Airflow doesn't care about brand prestige. Combustion doesn't reward corporate caution. Power comes from pressure, timing, and intent, not approval. Every shortcut was deliberate. Every deviation had a reason. The engine wasn't chasing perfection on paper, it was chasing dominance in motion. That's why it worked. While factories designed for the average driver on the worst day of ownership, this V8 was built for a single purpose and nothing else. It existed in a narrow window where fear was irrelevant and consequence was accepted. And inside that window, it produced results that looked impossible until you saw them firsthand. The builder understood that reliability and performance sit on opposite ends of a spectrum, and factories live in the middle by necessity. This engine lived at the edge. It was loud, temperamental, and demanding. But that was the price of honesty. Nothing about it pretended to be safe or polite. It only promised to do what it was built to do. The first time it happened, people assumed it was a fluke. Two cars lined up, one with a pedigree everyone recognized, the other sounding rougher, angrier, almost unfinished. When the light dropped, expectation said the factory muscle car would walk away clean. Instead, it didn't. The homemade V8 launched harder, pulled sooner, and by the time gears were grabbing air, the gap was undeniable. That disbelief became the pattern. At stoplights, at informal strip nights, in quiet stretches of road where reputations were settled without witnesses, the same outcome repeated itself. Factory cars with magazine covers to their name were being run down by something built in a garage. Drivers would laugh it off at first, blaming missed shifts or bad traction, until it happened again. And again, excuses ran out faster than the cars could recover. What stung wasn't just losing, it was losing to something that wasn't supposed to exist. There was no brand to blame, no update coming next year to fix the problem. The embarrassment was quiet, personal, and impossible to explain without admitting something uncomfortable. Power wasn't where everyone thought it lived. Word traveled the way it always does in those circles, quietly and selectively. You didn't announce a run against that car, you warned friends instead. Reputations shifted not through headlines, but through absence, through the sudden hesitation to line up again. The factory cars were still impressive, still beautiful, still valuable, but something had changed. They were no longer unquestioned, and the builder watched it all from the sidelines. No victory laps, no public claims, just confirmation. The theory had survived contact with reality, and reality had been ruthless. Every race rewrote the hierarchy a little more, proving that performance doesn't care about origin stories. It only responds to execution, and on asphalt, execution had spoken louder than any badge ever could. Each encounter left behind a quiet realization, one that spread faster than rumors ever could. If this could happen once, it could happen again, and that thought lingered long after engines cooled and pride refused to let go. Nobody wanted to be next. Silence followed every encounter after that night ended. From the outside, it's easy to wonder why factories didn't simply copy what worked and move on. The answer is that they couldn't, even if they wanted to. Manufacturers don't build engines for moments of glory. They build them for years of abuse. Every component must survive warranties, emissions testing, temperature extremes, poor maintenance, and drivers who never lift. That reality forces compromise long before performance is even considered. Cost is the first constraint that reshapes everything. A backyard builder can chase marginal gains without caring what each decision adds to the bill. A factory has a ceiling, and once it's reached, ambition stops. Marketing adds another layer of restraint. Brands sell reliability and trust, not mechanical risk. And an aggressive, temperamental engine doesn't photograph well for brochures or shareholder meetings. Then there's regulation, the quiet hand on the throat of innovation. Noise limits, fuel quality variance, emissions compliance, and global standards flatten creativity into something predictable. Factories must engineer for the weakest fuel, the least attentive owner, and the worst possible scenario, because they have to answer for every failure at scale. Builders don't. They optimize for one car, one purpose, and one environment, accepting the consequences without negotiation. That freedom changes everything. What looked like luck was really independence. The backyard V8 didn't win because it was magical. It won because it lived outside systems designed to avoid embarrassment at all costs. Factories protect reputations, builders chase outcomes, and when those worlds collide, possibility exposes the limits that caution quietly enforces. Those limits feel invisible until someone ignores them entirely, proving that constraint is often a choice disguised as responsibility rather than an unavoidable technical truth. Today, that backyard-built V8 survives less as a machine and more as an idea. It represents a moment when curiosity outran caution, when someone decided that permission was optional and risk was acceptable. In an era obsessed with polished products and approved pathways, that mindset feels almost uncomfortable because it suggests that progress doesn't always come from institutions. Modern muscle cars are faster, safer, and more refined than anything before them, but they carry the same constraints their predecessors did. Weight, regulation, branding, and mass appeal still shape what reaches the street. That doesn't make them dishonest or inferior. It simply means they are built to survive systems, not challenge them. Somewhere outside the spotlight, people are still experimenting. They are still questioning accepted limits, still building things that won't make sense until they work. They don't show up in brochures or investor calls, but they quietly move the ceiling upward, one risk at a time. The lesson here isn't that factories failed. It's what outsiders see differently. They aren't bound by scale or expectation, only by what they're willing to lose. That perspective has always driven the biggest leaps forward, even when history later smooths the edges. Legends aren't always born on assembly lines. Sometimes they appear briefly, disrupt assumptions, and disappear, leaving behind stories that refuse to die.